Hello, everyone. You're listening to the Blockchain Socialist podcast, and this is another installment of Overthrowing the Network State, a series that I've been doing in collaboration with Blockchaingov. And for this episode, I have actually a double-double, I'm realizing. I have two people on. Each of them have had one episode before where I've spoken to them. My co-host will be Kelsie Nabben, who is a researcher at Blockchaingov, and we're going to be talking to Quinn DuPont, another researcher who has recently, you gave a talk, I think it was the Trusted Seed Unconference, where you gave some of your sort of like initial criticisms and feedback about the network state to this group. So I really want to talk about that, since there's a lot of things that you had mentioned there I thought were really interesting and that, of course, I agreed with. And then you've also written a piece fairly recently, or an article, titled A Progressive Web3 from Social Coproduction to Digital Polycentric Governance. So we will cover that as well. But so to start off, what I wanted to ask you, Quinn, is because you're a historian of technology, and in the network state, Balaji, like kind of what he does, in my view at least, is that he kind of does like, I think like 80% of the book is sort of an attempt at recounting and reinterpreting history, largely through, in my opinion, a kind of like Silicon Valley venture capitalist lens. So I was wondering, with your knowledge as a historian, do you have any thoughts on, I guess, that type of framework when looking at history that he does, and what are kind of the more problematic things in the book?
Yeah, thanks. And hi both. It's great to be back here. You're talking about chapter 2 of the network state, which, like any book that's been appropriately edited, is like 10 times the length of every other chapter. So, and that chapter, it's called History's Trajectory, and I think there's like just in general, talking about the network state is very frustrating because it's hard to sort of take it seriously, but I'll do my best and I'll try to see what I can kind of pull out of it. And I guess like the first thing to sort of reflect on is, before even I get into the positive, I would say the positive account that Balaji offers of this notion of history as trajectory. Maybe it's helpful just to step back a little. You suggested it's kind of the Silicon Valley venture capital modality. I think that's sort of right, but I think we can actually we can go a little further, and we can actually frame Balaji's interest in a very particular mode of scholarship that arose in the mid 20th century. So roughly maybe post-war, post-Second World War, up to roughly maybe about the 1970s. So 1950s to 1970s, there was two big trends that were happening in political science and maybe sociology, but really political science. And the first is basically, sometimes it gets called like modernization theory. It goes back to people like Durkheim and sort of classical sociologists, even people like Marx and Smith and all these sorts of folks. And it kind of, the challenge of modernization theory sort of tackles is this question about like, why are some countries doing well and some are not doing well, right? And then this mantle gets picked up again by people like Emanuel Wallerstein, who is associated with what's called world systems theory. And I would just encourage readers to sort of maybe even just go like check out Wikipedia or whatever on world systems theory, and it'll give you like a pretty reasonable sense of what it's all about and some of the criticisms. But one of the main criticisms, and I think the kind of like where this account really falls down, is world systems theory is particularly designed to make analyses of core countries and periphery countries. And in doing so, it strongly reinforces core countries. It strongly reinforces the sort of our analytical lens on them, and it tries to explain basically why periphery countries are struggle and core countries do well. It tries to explain things like extractive measures. Why does the United States go over to pick random country somewhere else and presumably does its capitalist thing. All of these are claims that are like world system theory has its virtues, it has its some benefits, but all of it is like, let's just call it what it is. It's 70-year-old political theory. Like Balaji's grandparents probably could offer us a better account of the network state, having never seen a computer, than Balaji, just because he's so powerfully swayed by this. And this is my reading, anyways, because I can't explain any other reason why he'd have such an incredible interest in centering the nation state. He claims that he's trying to get to this nation, or this network state. He's trying to move it out of the way. But I mean, he says, like, what is one of the main things that the network state needs to do is it needs to be seen as what's the term he uses here now? It's basically not legitimate, but rather it needs to have a bureaucratic attachment to and to establish nation states, right? And this just seems like I just don't understand the motivation why, if we're trying to, if we're being radicals or even just reformists here, why we need to go back and come to the nation state asking permission to be seen as representative or legitimate or some way real. I think there's just so many other options today, and I'm happy to kind of like we can get into that. And for me, one of the big ones, he says right at the beginning, he says, look, DAOs aren't they're not network states. And I would have thought like that would have been a really good place to start to think about how a network state might develop or something like this, right? At the very least, we need to come up with an account of like organic production. Like, where does this stuff come from, right? Balaji's account just sort of assumes that people have some intrinsic motivation for this. But that's where we're left at. And we're left at this really very high superficial level. So, I mean, I can say more about the kind of, I could even go through and pick apart the actual claims in that long chapter 2. But I think that's sort of its fundamental limiting constraint, is that it's stuck in political theory from 70 years ago.
Interesting. Yeah, I think one of the things that's, it's like there's this obsession with trying to project like a particular future, I get the feeling, or like that there's this like automatic like, yes, this is going to happen and this is how it's going to evolve. And he just needed like I don't know, like I can see why. I don't know that much about it, but I've read like a little bit that there's like these links with like fascism and sort of like futurism as like having sort of like inevitability of like something going to happen. And there are some weird overlaps that maybe I don't want to go into about like how Silicon Valley investing, or just like maybe venture capital investing in general, happens, of trying to like predict a particular future that the world is going to move towards. And then he has this like very strange, like he tries to mathematize history, I guess, in a certain way. Like this was like a helical theory of history or something like this, that I also found very strange. So then it's like, oh, there is this trajectory that we're going towards and it's going to happen. But then he also like allows for like, oh, and also we're in this giant cycle of like, super cycles of like things that I always come across these like weird kind of like hippie like video type of stuff in the past of like we're in these like 5,000 year super cycles of like things that are repeating themselves, and whether or not there's any merit to that, I don't really know. But I thought it was strange. It was like this weird mixing of.
I think you're on to a couple things there. I mean, the first is he very straightforwardly, I mean, his chapter 232, I'm just looking at it here. Technological truth is the driving force of history. So, driving force of history,
Which,
there's a presumption that there is a driving force of history, right?
But the driving
as though we believe in teleologies or something, right? We're like Aristotelian here. And then the other part of that technological truth part, that's just straightforward technocracy, good old fashioned technocracy, and that has heaps of criticisms and like limitations. And I guess, and what he's trying to get at, this driving force. I mean, he makes there's lots of sort of just historical inaccuracies in the account, and we don't really need to like go through those. Unfortunately, they're the kind of thing that if you're not aware of the inaccuracies, the ideology is most likely just to kind of sweep over you, and you're going to take it as accepted. I mean, he actually criticizes this. He has this, what is it? Gell-Mann amnesia. This concept of Gell-Mann amnesia, which is actually, it's such a non-idea that it was popularized. It was stated by Michael Crichton, the guy that wrote Jurassic Park, so not a scholar. But the point of that is that when you are reading the idea of this amnesia is that when you're reading a piece of media that you are familiar with and you see it riddled with facts, the conclusion is that you should cast out the whole thing because it's just a pile of lies or whatever. And he quite openly he accuses the New York Times of this, right? As a historian of technology, I mean, that just accurately describes this book. It's riddled with facts, and so it's very hard to take seriously. But that said, I think this idea of the driving force, what he's trying to get at, my hunch is, and this is this helical history, and he even calls it. He says history can move through the z-axis or z-axis, right? And so he's interested in this very old-fashioned idea that he kind of cribs from a number of thinkers, including people like Nietzsche, and where there's a reciprocating nature to the world. There's an eternal return or something. We come back, but he's not comfortable with that because
right.
He's hard drive in Silicon
Valley. That means
Valley
stagnation if you go back.
Yeah. So he says, okay, so what we do is we think of this the circle, but then let's pull it into another
turn into a slinky.
Exactly, it's a slinky. It really is. It's a slinky. That's that z-axis. He's sort of he wants to see. And there is a lot of there's a fairly large tradition that's been properly discounted at this point around cyclical histories, right? K waves and on and on and on. There's just loads of books that have been written about trying to see the cyclical nature of history, and none of these have ever no historian today really takes them seriously. But okay, so what can we get out of this? I will say the one thing that he's not completely wrong about is, you mentioned this mathematization he's sort of interested in. I actually do believe that there is an opportunity for using mathematical models and large data sets that we see associated. We've got digital traces on the from these systems interacting and individuals taking part of them and so on and so forth, to do proper sociological work, do some computational social science with these data sets. I think that's actually right. So I think his interest in kind of getting some math into the story is right. It's just that he offers us a bunch of options and no way to say we should take this approach or that approach or whatever. And more to the point, he has no idea about all the literatures that actually do this kind of work. There's decades of work on online communities and within information science and information systems. And, people have modeled the dynamics of these systems extensively, qualitative and quantitatively. And, there's lots of important sociological things that have emerged out of that, and issues that he doesn't seem to have any interest in, like simple ones like trust or commitment, legitimacy, just lots and lots of things that are as particular to a DAO or to presumably a network state as they are to Wikipedia or Linux. And this has all been studied, but none of this, of course, is in here.
Always start with a literature review if there's one thing that we've learned.
Yeah, that's right.
I think that's quite interesting, and what resonates with me from what you've said is something that has been mentioned in previous episodes, and I'd very much encourage people to go back and listen to some of the recordings in this series, especially the first one. And this idea of challenging the state by creating the same thing. To create a state against the structure of the state centers this statehood, as you've pointed out. And I'm quite interested in thinking about, alternatives, or kind of going through more of the dynamics of what you sort of position Web3 as in your recent paper, which mentioned in the intro, in terms of a progressive Web3 from social co-production to digital polycentric governance. And so I think this practice of kind of talking about potential alternatives or alternative lenses is quite important. And so in that paper, you cast a different vision of Web3 than spin all the way down, which is one of the references in the beginning. So how would you describe what is happening in blockchain communities through a social movement lens, and why this idea of either anti-establishment or community network in some respect is kind of resonating with Web3 people more broadly?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the first thing to say is I don't start from a position of, let's say, ideology, right? So I don't find it helpful just to say, well, I'm an anarchist and therefore I believe in these sorts of things. Or I'm a socialist and I believe in these sorts of things. Instead, that paper, and I think the insight that would be most germane here, is to recognize that we're not trapped into the kinds of conclusions that Balaji wants us to think that we're trapped. And the example I really focus on in that paper, and it's in the title, Digital Polycentric Governance. Polycentric governance, just to like say a few words about that. This is this idea that was popularized by Elinor Ostrom. She won a Nobel Prize in economics for her work on developing this idea of polycentric governance. It's actually her husband, Vincent Ostrom, that came up with the idea, but she did all this work around it. And polycentric governance has this sort of sound. This sounds like, oh, well, all we need to do is just like let, to use Glenn Wheel's term, plurality just kind of explode or whatever, right? And when this will kind of all work out. Ostrom says, no, like that's not. We shouldn't expect polycentric governance to be easy or even efficient, but rather what we have is an opportunity to think about nested, interlocking, multi-scalar organizations that, by the very nature that there are many of them and that they're nesting and multi-scalar and all these kinds of things, we can observe in the real world. We can go out and, like, this is what Ostrom did. She went around the world and did all these rich case studies to find examples of people coming together on their own volition, no outside exogenous force or state requiring them to come together and escape the tragedy of the commons, to escape these contexts where where otherwise we're going to over extract a resource, or we're going to end up with pollution, or we're going to end up with some kind of collective action challenge. And, there is no one simple answer to polycentric governance. That's what makes it work. It's not that there's one framework or one model. It's a context specific process. And when I look at Web3, I see quite readily we've got digital commons. We've got these tokens and cryptocurrencies that are produced. They need to be managed. They need, there's an economics to them. And we actually have examples, such as they are. Some of them are a little bit challenged at times, of them being, of these digital commons being well managed, well governed. As, in other words, examples of real live examples, not fictitious ones like a network state, of effective polycentric governance. And I think that just is like that by itself, that the fact that people are able to do this makes this whole model seem really implausible, because we have a completely realistic option that I think everyone can get their head around, which is like, oh, well, we don't need to be rational egoists and all. Like, we can actually step back and say, you know what, I'd be better off if I constrained myself, set up my own set of rules that, made it so that I can't just abuse the commons. But we're all going to be better off. And as it turns out, people are more than ready to do that. It's not a fabrication. It's an entirely real empirical phenomenon. So that he misses that entirely is, I think, striking.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing you say is that what people are excited about is this capacity or potential to self-organize. And that really comes back to the heart of, public blockchains, some of the kind of history of kind of community and ideology that they stem from in terms of the cypherpunks, but also, I would say how they have evolved to, much more kind of heterogeneous expressions from, DAOs to DeFi to, regenerative finance and so on. And I like that starting point as well. I should say I'm an ethnographer, so I try not to start from an ideological standpoint and then peddle that either. I'm trying to understand, what's going on here through the observation of the practices of people, in their everyday. What do they tell you and what do they actually do? And so just for the listeners that might find this a new concept, there's a paper called From Polyany to Ostrom, and that talks about, three main features of polycentric systems as multiple centers of decision making, an overarching set of rules. So one could think about that as an underarching set of rules in the case of an L1 blockchain protocol. And evolution through spontaneous competition among decision-making centers. And there's been some great scholarship in the blockchain space recently. I'm thinking of Eric Elston on governance as conflict, but how through those interactions between parties or actors in the system, that's where decision-making and other processes of governance occur.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary and good starting point. And you underline the importance of dispute, of resolution, and the production of order. Right. That those are, and this is what we should assume. Not this. This isn't the edge case. This is how polycentric governance works. Is through these dispute resolution types of mechanisms. So I think that's really, and that's just a form of self-governance, right? That's how we get that self-governance started. And it has the advantage, unlike the network state, is that it gives us a psychologically realistic model to think about, right? Like we don't have to. So just even step back a little further from like Ostrom's work in polycentric governance, it's part of this shift that occurred in sort of the last 20, 30 years towards what's called neo-institutionalism. And neo-institutionalism moves away from the focus from the last century on rationality, like egoistic rationality, the kind of like rational choice type of strong rationality, efficiency, efficacy, these kinds of issues. And instead it replaces that set of concerns with the softer stuff. So neo-institutionalism thinks about legitimacy, trust, ordering, affect, commitment. Commitment is a huge issue for all of these mechanisms. Of course, we have high voice exit dynamics, right? So we need to think about that. We need to, there's commitment becomes a really central key issue in ways that we all of a sudden we see rationality, or even I'd even say scarcity and other features we might associate with traditional economic rationality. Those all kind of, fade away in many respects, right? And I think when you start to take a very significant and serious look at not just Bitcoin, which is the clear focus here, it's borderline that Balaji knows anything but Bitcoin. But when you start to look at the broader crypto space, you see less economic rationality going on, in much more socialization and just other intrinsic reasons for participation, right? We can start to think about style. We can start to think about subcultural belonging. We can, all of these are dimensions that, on our neo-institutional model make sense and give us a reasonable story as to how we might see the formation of a network state. The only one that we maybe would be able to pull out of Balaji's work, implicit in some of that work around, as mentioned before, world systems theory and this kind of stuff, is usually those accounts start from the division of labor. That's where Durkheim started with. And that's fine. I actually think that's a reasonable place to start with when we start to think about the production of collectivities of individuals. The division of labor is a good place. We then need to start to take class very seriously, and class is completely absent here. So, it's not like it doesn't help us any, but I think for the researcher who's not committed to the network state, that's a fine place to start.
Yeah. I think it's it's interesting that you bring up, Elinor Ostrom and sort of like this commons theory as being a potential just like alternative place to look at that is, I guess looks at similar types of questions that I guess the network state kind of tries to answer to, or like the things that people who are interested in the network state think that they're interested in, or what they are actually interested in, but then like I think fall into the trap of the network state. I think that's interesting because like as you mentioned before, like Balaji mentions DAOs I think like 2 or 3 times like throughout the book. It's not really
not too many times.
It's not a huge thing in the network state when you would think that it would be. Like I would have thought that it was going to be talking about DAOs and smart contracts as like being the things to handle bureaucratic processes, but it doesn't at all. It doesn't talk about the sort of functionings of the state really much. And to your point about you said like the neo-institutionalist framework, like going at the more softer stuff and like subcultures, it's almost like you can tell that he has such a poor understanding of subcultures, I guess, by being like, whatever subculture you're in, we'll make a network state about it, If you're in the anti-FDA subculture aesthetic, like that, you'll just want to live your entire life in that type of world. But I think at the same time, I don't know if it's like just having an insane amount of wealth. Like I imagine in his head, he's probably like, oh, well, if I'm tired of my anti-FDA network state, I'll just go and, I'll be a citizen of my, other network state of this other thing that I like. It's very strange.
I don't actually have a problem with this idea that we can just imagine everyone is rich and has no material challenges. I'm actually fine with that. we can just start with we're digital or whatever, right? And just black box the fleshiness of my human reality. I'm actually kind of okay with that. It's just that, as you sort of suggest, like, well, for instance, he has this screed against woke ideology, right?
Yeah, wokeism has infested every single institution across the globe, and we're just surrounded, being forced into wokeism. It's just how I don't understand. Like, what world do you live in where you believe this? I don't know.
I mean, it's one I think that reads too many bad newspapers. But what gets me is he clearly just doesn't like woke people or whatever, right? There's the other thing implied in all
whatever
of this,
that means.
There's a hard-boiled masculinity throughout this book, right? Like straight up, like women aren't part of it. I mean, he uses the masculine. He uses men. I mean, and whatever. That might be rhetoric, but I think actually just reading it, you get the sense of a hard-boiled masculinity. Like this is dripping in testosterone in this account, right?
Maybe I want to be the charismatic founder of my own network state, guys.
Kelsie is a girl boss, actually.
The thing I don't get about wokeness and his screed against it is that actually I think is a paradigmatic example that he should be like leveraging. Like the woke ideology, whether you think it's great or terrible, it's effective, right? It's weird. He takes this highly effective, networked, media saturated phenomenon, right? And which you'd think would be the fabrication of, like, that's the basis of a network state, I would almost think, right? This is the idea of we have these high alignments coming together. But just because he can't get over himself, he's like, well, we got to dunk on wokeism. And I think actually the opposite. He should be saying, look, I think woke is stupid, but that's a great example of a proto network state. It's people coming together for all these various reasons, and we could articulate what that all might be, right? But he doesn't do any of that.
I think he does mention at one point, like, the wokes could, like, become decentralized, or not, or that wokes are decentralized, but they could become more like the crypto people, basically, if they had wanted to, if they knew how to do it. But I don't know. I mean, it's definitely, in my view, like he uses like the trick of threes, like where like here are the two like seemingly opposing forces out there in the world, and here's this third one that nobody's really thought about, but is actually growing, and we should join it. And this is the only good option. Which is you have the CCP, NYT, BTC, which is like, I don't know, just like a obscene oversimplification.
And this is what makes it difficult, because it's hard is when you're dealing with entities that are so abstract. I mean, he talks about left and right,
but also the left is right and right is left, actually.
Exactly. And this should just be probably a good flag that we're not dealing with anything that's attached to reality, because we don't know what to make sense. I don't know how to make sense of this. Like, what kind of distinctions can I draw from something that is like it is and it isn't the same thing, right? I mean, this just sounds like sort of tautological opinion making.
Hi everyone, if you're enjoying this episode so far, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, share with a friend, and join the crypto leftist communities on Discord or Reddit, which you can find links to in the show notes. If you're enjoying the episode or find the content and being important, you can pitch into my efforts starting at $3 a month on patreon.com/theblockchainsocialist to help me out. As a patron, you get a shout out on an episode and access to bonus content like Q&A episodes where you can submit and vote on questions you'd like me to answer, and I'll give my thoughts in roughly 20 minutes. In the last bonus episode, I analyzed applying an anti-capture framework made for DAOs but towards left-wing organizing. Of course, I'll still be making free content like this episode to help spread the message that crypto doesn't need to be used to further entrench capitalist exploitation if we put our efforts into it. So if that message resonates with you, I hope you'll consider helping out.
So coming back to this perspective about Ostrom and the idea of kind of voluntary organization rather than a coercive state and governance of the commons or common pool resources, how do you translate that theory to a Web3 or a blockchain-based context? As we've pointed out, that hasn't really been done in terms of like what are the bits and pieces that create, a network state. And one of my observations is, the importance of context. Like in the studies that Ostrom did, they're very, very context dependent. So how do you pass that, I guess, to Quinn, and how do you translate that to a blockchain-based setting?
Yeah, I think you're onto something there. The voluntary nature of it, I think we can draw on Balaji a little bit here, is he does recognize the need for this alignment of individuals. That's what he calls it, right? I think that's necessary for when we have these voluntary participatory networks of people, but we need to think about all the other characteristics that go into human beings. So senses of belonging, right? That's important. I have to feel like I belong to something. If we take that social movement lens, we then can think about collective identity, right? If I'm a Boy Scout leader, well, that's part of my collective identity. And how do I go about getting that? Do I start with that collective identity, or do I get it later as part of some indoctrination process or whatever it might be? I mentioned before issues of commitment, and there's just a whole host of I think social and psychological factors that are both. And the other important thing to keep in mind is we've got structural factors, infrastructural issues, as well as intrinsic motivations, right? And we need to have a story that can make sense of both of these, right? Of the macro and the micro. And there's lots of good work out there that does these sorts of issues. And these are fundamental challenges that economists, for instance, deal with. And Balaji kind of like, he sort of crashes up against this, and he realizes he just gives up. He says, well, I can't talk about both structural and micro, and he just focuses on one. His theory of history, he's very focused on micro history is what he calls, right? And this is that story that he offers. He says, well, all we need to do is we just need to take facts or history. He doesn't even say facts. He says history as some nebulous abstract thing, and put that on a specifically Bitcoin blockchain, and that'll give us our verified history that can never change or whatever. I mean, that's the whole thing. Kind of doesn't make sense because, first, like, what are these facts? I mean, he's so critical of mainstream media, right? He says, "Oh, New York Times is nothing but lies." So at the very least, all we can expect a blockchain to record would be the lies of the New York Times, right? I mean, that's, I think, all we can expect. But I think the more substantial point, what he completely misses, is there's a subtle move. And I've written in the past about this a few times. I have this article with Bill Maher in King's Review that opens up the question around basically the production of facts in blockchain systems in particular. If we take a slightly more what's called a social constructivist view, less of a realist view of the world, we can see that what makes blockchains kind of so interesting with regard to history or to facts is that it is the blockchain itself that makes the fact. It's not like facts are external and then they get, verified. And the two features, I mean, I'll just kind of point out, this is a little bit heady, but there's a theorist by the name of Bruno Latour, and he has this idea of immutable mobiles. And I think actually blockchains kind of work like immutable mobiles for the following reason. First of all, so immutable mobiles, the idea is that you've got this interaction between something that's mobile, it has circulation, it moves, and then of course immutable, it's static, right? And it's precisely the tension between there that's how facts get produced. And so in the case of blockchains, well, immutable, we know immutable, that's the blocks after, they get sealed up and they become immutable. Okay, check, we got that. Okay, that's great. And mobile, well, that's the economy, that's the circulation of the tokens. And what's interesting is through that dual process, we produce facts because after time, we just have to take that, blockchain as authoritative. Like, this is how we get authority, right? And so it doesn't actually much matter if that fact was like strictly speaking true or false or whatever. It just becomes true by being immutable and by being mobile. And there is loads and loads and loads of research in science and technology studies talking about particularly scientific and technological artifacts as producing facts. I could cite books and books that have sort of demonstrated this very reliable, robust kind of result in science. And if you have a passing sense of like modern science today, you get the idea, right? I mean, most of the facts that scientists talk about today are not things that exist out in the real world in any meaningful sense. We just produce them with the instruments that we have. And so blockchain being a different social form of very much the same kinds of things that we see happening from scientific labs across to universities to other spaces of innovation.
Yeah, I'm very much into that idea of, blockchains as socio-technical infrastructures. And perhaps I'll add something that came out yesterday. I'll send it to put in the show notes about, Web3 as infrastructures. But you coined the phrase digital common pool resources in the paper. Would you like to explain that concept in a little more context?
Sure. The insight is that, there's two insights. One, that I think it's meaningful to try to rehabilitate this Ostrom-esque polycentric governance framework because it makes sense of a lot of the sorts of things that we see happening, right? We see polycentrism out there in the world, and we can at least gives us some sort of dynamics to think about, right? So we've got common pool resources that are inherited from this framework of polycentric governance. Now, a common pool resource is a unique kind of resource because it's not a public resource and it's not a private resource. It's sort of in between. And if you go to Wikipedia, you'll see this great little 2x2 box that shows how goods can be rivalrous and excludable. And common pool resources they sit in the interesting category of, let me see if I get this right, being not excludable, but being rivalrous. This is so we see lots of examples in the good old fashioned world of common pool resources, like a fishing stock, right? So we have to manage the fish in the lake, because if we over extract them, we're going to have a population collapse and all these sorts of bad things. And so how do we now make sense of that in Web3? Well, things are different. First of all, we're dealing with digital common pool resources. They're not material. And so one of the big issues you have emerging with traditional common pool resources is crowding or congestion, right? If you have too many people coming to a resource, effectively you can just bump up against one another. And so that's something you kind of have to manage. In the digital realm, of course, that's not an issue, because these are just digital constitutive things we've made up, right? We only have artificial scarcity. But what we do have instead is, for instance, we have scaling problems. So crowding associated with common pool resources becomes scaling associated with digital common pool resources. And I think there's actually a whole whack of other dynamics we can probably pull out and start to think about how the digital nature is different. So another important one is on blockchain systems, security, monitoring, and surveillance are effectively, you get them for free. That is not the case in most traditional polycentric governance situations. One of the challenges one of the downsides about polycentric governance is that it's inefficient and costly, because every single little polycentric unit needs to hire their own surveillance team, their own monitoring and security apparatuses. We don't actually have the problems like that in blockchain. We get all that security kind of for free. Now it's not absolute security. The other important thing to kind of be aware of, and actually Balaji completely misses it in his discussion of history. He seems to think that if it's on a Bitcoin blockchain, it's anonymous and secure. There is at this point, if you're relatively up on de-anonymization techniques and other kinds of attacks on these blockchains, you'll appreciate that none of these are fully secure systems. And I can point to lots and lots of examples. Even just Wired magazine has been running articles mostly discussing the use of chain analysis. It's called a reactor tool, I think. And it systematically de-anonymizes and clusters supposedly pseudonymous accounts and tracks people down, and they're making arrests all the time around the world. Child porn rings are getting taken down, money launderers getting taken down, terrorists are getting taken down. I have an old joke. I spoke with a FINRA intelligence agent years ago, like 2014 kind of type thing, and I asked them what they thought about Bitcoin at the time, and he said, Quinn, we don't have a problem with blockchain. We just think it's prosecution futures. And he turned out he's right. He was right. Today it is. It's just prosecution futures, right? Obviously there's a complicated story there. There are systems that are more secure and less secure and these kinds of things, and we can make systems secure and we can improve the security and all these kinds of things. But I think that's one of the important ways that we're dealing with a distinctly different infrastructure, and so we need to take the lessons that we get from common pool resources, but update them for a new digital environment. And that's just, I think, a research project that we all sort of have to face.
Yeah, and if you're not planning to do anything illegal, you can just look at the cyber security kind of vulnerabilities, subscribe to RECT, R-E-K-T, and see them kind of come through daily in terms of hacks or things that have occurred just of different chains.
It's so weird, I don't know, I think he called it crypto history, is like this new form of technical truth, I think. It just comes off as very, it's a weird STEMmy thing, like STEM superiority thing that I get sometimes. Like there's this weird, I think I've talked about it before, but like a weird kind of aestheticization of whether you studied STEM or whether you studied social science that I find very silly. And yeah, he's definitely sort of coding STEM people as being like freedom fighters that are going to progress the world into the future, which has a right-wing tinge to it, of course.
I don't have any. I actually, I think drawing significant focus on technical infrastructure is really important. I don't think that's wrong. I would actually be much more satisfied with this book if he had went and did a rigorous empirical or statistical study of these kinds of networks. But that I think that would actually be really
that wouldn't have sold so well in the crypto world, maybe.
No.
Amongst crypto people.
So.
Yeah, so maybe coming back to what you call a progressive Web3, you mentioned that it must address three much more difficult criticisms. And, these are not really issues that are covered in the network state. So I'm interested in your perspective of them. And then perhaps after that, we can talk about, how existing Web3 also, even though it's not a network state, doesn't necessarily live up to this in all respects. But you talk about financialization, assetization, and quantification. Number 2, commodity fetishism. And number 3, digital inequality.
Those are just 3 examples, I think, that we need to focus on if we want to imagine a progressive Web3. And why I highlighted them is because they replace 3 criticisms that you typically see. One, you see a criticism of technology, not in Balaji, but people like David Golumbia. He says, well, or David Gerard, and they'll criticize. And they'll say the technology is not ready or whatever. That's a fine criticism, but that's like that's just solved in a version upgrade, right? So that's not a real criticism. Culture, another one is culture, or ideology or beliefs and things like this, right? Many people who are kind of new to the space, maybe they heard about Bitcoin just a couple of years ago or something like that, really fail to appreciate the tremendous change that has occurred over the first decade. Now, I actually think Balaji is a little bit unaware of some of this change as well. If you've been involved in Web3 in the last year, it's unrecognizable. The people involved, their interests, the interactions, that's completely unrecognizable to when I started investigating Bitcoin in 2012.
Yeah, I wonder if he actually participated in a DAO. I'd be fascinated to know, like, what DAOs is he a part of where he's in the forums and voting?
I'm sure he's never.
I mean, I imagine he might have like voted, with a bunch of tokens that he got from venture capital investment or something like that. But
so this is a good point Kelsie, you asked me to sort of think about some of the challenges. Okay, so maybe then, so I replaced those 3. So technology, culture, and what's the third one? I mean, it doesn't matter. The point is that we have these more substantial, difficult political economic challenges, right? Inequality. Everybody, if you look at who owns crypto today, it's really, really highly, unequal, right? How do we solve that? Well, there's lots of potential design solutions. There's, whatever. There's, we can think of, there's progressive coins out there that are trying to do neat stuff. Some of it's misguided, some of it's awesome, whatever. And other kinds of issues, thinking about commodity fetishism. So we tend to think that the thing itself has some value in it. Some of this is that gold bug kind of stuff that we see with Bitcoin. And there's any number of political economic kinds of concerns we can think about, and we need to sort of resolve these. But the reality you mentioned. Okay, so how does Web3 actually do this? This isn't actually what we see quite with Web3 today. Web3 is very inchoate. It's often, people say, oh, well, it's just a subreddit with a bank account. And that's not like far off. We're not necessarily dealing with super sophisticated governance here. We're not dealing with super sophisticated dispute resolution. We're dealing with a whole bunch of different attempts at it. And I think in that plurality and that that's where that vibrancy comes. But the reality is somewhat different in Web3. And here's a a fact I would kind of like to throw out there to think about. If you look at the voting, on-chain voting, go to snapshot.org and look at the sort of who does all the voting. You have these delegative voting mechanisms in Web3. So I can take my tokens, my governance tokens, and I can send them over to Kelsie, and she can, represent me in some sense or whatever. In Web3, what we actually see is a massive centralization and agglomeration of delegate voting focused on one particular entity. AZ16, the Silicon Valley venture capitalists. They have a massive presence in Web3 space, and they are the governors.
No, but they're decentralized.
Yeah, right. So I sort of tell the story about this is it's prefigurative. This is something a Web3. We don't have a progressive Web3. We have the makings of a progressive Web3, as we believe, but we don't have one, not today.
Yeah, I agree. I've actually written about that as well in Charles Babbage Interfaces. I did an ethnography, which was awesome, with an amazing community called Friends with Benefits. It does Web3 for creatives. But yeah, their community was in this kind of moment of sort of realization and discussion about the role of Silicon Valley investors in buying up tokens, which was really interesting.
Yeah.
And just to your point about, sorry, go on.
Well, I just wanted to highlight also Balaji's. I know you talked a little bit about this on the episode with Prima and Glenn Wheel. The idea of this need for a founder. This is something that it's really clear that Balaji is playing from the same playbook as AZ16, and AZ16 has this influential blog post called it's their decentralization playbook, and it's very fascinating to read, because what you realize by reading it is they say, okay, what you need, they sort of tell the story of so you want to start a DAO, or you want to start a decentralized crypto or whatever. The first thing you're going to run into, as we all know, is how are you going to get the users, and how are you going to keep the users, and how are you going to get some strategic vision, and how are you going to get all that energy and all that kind of stuff. And they say, well, what you need is a core founder who needs to get some venture capital and then progressively decentralize. And that's an interesting model, but by no means is that the only model, or even remotely the best model. And more to the point, we actually have lots of anthropological evidence that that's not how people come together. They never have. And a lot of what Balaji has is he uses words like tribes and things like this a lot, right? Has this imagination of this Hobbesian sort of world where we have humans running around with sticks and, they're hunting dinosaurs or whatever they're doing. No anthropological record indicates this, right? Humans have always been social. There's no such thing as a human that's abstracted from that. And so that's to say, that's not how nations are built. They don't start with some founder who's I'm going to stand up and speak for the people. Nations don't start that way, and other collectivities don't start that way. The history throughout. The only ones that do are fascistic or, otherwise totalitarian. And so that's the model he's interested in. He's interested in the one where it has this one central figure. But that's the aberration. That's not the normal.
Yeah. What is absolutely insane to me, actually, because I'm writing a piece for Outland at the moment, but I did a little bit of research. I have not really read Hobbes much at all, but I found out that it's just very ironic that he would actually use Hobbes for this concept, because Hobbes had he wrote that kind of this brutal or brute situation or state of nature of the war of all against all, that humans were naturally animalistic and they would kill each other, but the only way that to sort of prevent that is by a strong undivided government. And so he is really into libertarianism. It's clear in other things he's talked about and throughout the book, but like fundamental to his framework is like this guy, the philosopher who is like really, really into big government, like really, really into the states, and probably like loves the FDA or whatever because it keeps people from injecting themselves with weird potions or something.
Yeah, well, he probably hates the FDA, but I actually think the Hobbes,
I'm
the
saying
turn
Hobbes.
to
Hobbes
Hobbes,
probably loved the would love the
oh, Hobbes,
FDA.
absolutely, yeah. The turn to Hobbes is probably because Balaji is either scared of the possibility of just like masses self-organizing, um, or just doesn't see it as realistic or something. He had a failure of imagination, would be one way to put that. The Hobbes story is really kind of a problematic one because um, it requires this imagination of a situation where we really are stuck, and the only way out of being stuck, because we're these rational egoists who are going to murder each other, a very sad vision of what a human is to give away the one thing that I think Balaji values the most, our liberty. Give it away to the sovereign, right? And to go back to my sort of earlier point around polycentric governance, we have lots of examples that show us that that's not necessary. We don't need to assume this characterization, and we don't even need to be abstract or fancy in our theory about it. We can actually just point to lots of good examples where we have collectivities coming together, and there's no Leviathan at all.
And Quinn, to that point, we don't even need to look beyond Web3 for those examples of polycentricity. For example, we're already seeing in DAOs overarching kind of governance layers and sub-DAOs with that, those multiple sort of centers of decision-making power and governance occurring, in the interactions between, different, functions in a system. But, I would also point out that they're not perfectly efficient or effective in their current form either.
Yeah, I think that's right. I don't have anything other to say. That sounds absolutely right. I think you nailed it.
So the next book could be going and doing more empirical research on these things that are actually already occurring, which we're working on.
Yeah, and I think that goes all the way back to sort of where that's one of the things that makes the network state so frustrating to talk about, is it is clearly a piece of rhetoric and ideology. And like, that's fine. My essay on Progressive 3 is also meant to support a vision of the world. It has a rhetorical component to it, so I don't have any problem with that. It's I guess what I find so dissatisfying about the book is that, other than a few references to some of the things we see with Bitcoin, but even there, we don't see any of the major kinds of discussion points that we would have expected to see, even with Bitcoin. We have very little empirical grounding in blockchain and crypto in the network state. Like he's talking about the interaction between Tesla and the Chinese state and New York Times and the United States and woke people and all these kinds of things, right? But very rarely does he end up talking about, for instance, the Ethereum merge, a massive, unprecedented success story in governance and change management, such that, it's really impressive what the merge did. It reduced the energy consumption of Ethereum by 99.95%. They swapped out effectively the engine while the car was driving down the road. That is, whether you think Ethereum's great or terrible, that's just something to think about. And like, that's very impressive. Where, and then on the flip side, of course, we've got Bitcoin continuing to sort of, flounder and not really be able to get their governance sorted out, and and really respond to the kinds of criticisms that they need to be responding to. But none of this is in the network state. Like, and we don't even have analytical or even intuitive like on ramps to have these discussions. Like, I don't know how I'd be able to talk about the scaling debate and in Bitcoin, and vis-a-vis the network state. He doesn't offer us any sort of story there, right? There's certainly no design patterns for that, but moreover, there's just hardly no mention of it. And so I think that's kind of like the really, it's a very frustrating part of the book, and it makes it just so much wishing and hopefulness. And I would much rather read a book that actually talked about the reality of the situation, and then offer some, suggestions and points for how maybe we can get to a new world. And in a network state, some of the parts are good. I think it's interesting to think about land, actual materialities. I think it's interesting. He talks a little bit about how you can have all these different kinds of network states, these archipelagos. That sort of sounds like a polycentrism. We've got alignment of interests. I think that's interesting too. But none of these have anything to do, unfortunately, with crypto. And so we're kind of at a bit of a loss.
Yeah, I think the network state's definitely sort of like what it brings to mind. If I were to see the concept, the network state, written, in golden letters in front of me, I would immediately come to mind thinking about digital governance, like using networks like the internet for digital governance that sort of solve this problem of the nation state being kind of like both too big and too small. We talked about in the first episode, for a lot of different types of problems, and trying to find some kind of medium or some kind of just alternative to answers for those really big problems that require a lot of coordination and a lot of thinking about solving. But I think Balaji is so obsessed with this, with exit, and is so obsessed with kind of not having governance. I think maybe his position as a very, very rich person, he probably finds governance as something that's very annoying. He is probably wanting to deal with everything that he probably usually does with his money. And when you have that type of capital, then you are able to do so.
I just wanted to highlight something that sort of slipped my mind. I think it's a very important feature of more generally polycentric governance that we should, and it's the kind of thing that we should see in Balaji's story, which is the following. He talks a lot about, the evils of the Soviet, empire and all this sorts of thing. But what he misses is one of the central challenges of, or one of the key challenges of central planning, as we sort of know, is that when you have a hierarchical model, you end up with a kind of an epistemological issue. So the centrally planned nation state has has masses, it has all the citizens, there's all these minds at the sort of edge of the network, and they all have private information. I have private information about the road condition on my street that the people over in City Hall, or even further, the federal legislative buildings in Canada, there's an epistemological gap there. They have no understanding of the condition of the roads at my house. And how can they? Because there's just too much hierarchy between me and them. And this is a limitation. This is a limitation because in our highly complex world, a world that embraces networks, we in fact have lots of interesting opportunities to fix this epistemological challenge, and we can kind of turn it on its head and go bottom up. And so this is the idea behind self-governance. If we are able to use some information infrastructures, in particular, we've got markets and auctions and other kinds of polycentric governance mechanisms that we can support, we'll be able to, or the idea is, collect the private information from the edges of the network and then put them into these little polycentric, interlocking, multi-scalar systems. And that is how we can get not centralized top-down authority, but rather bottom-up authority and bottom-up awareness of the individual preferences and context that people live in. And I think I would think for Balaji, being a strong libertarian, it's emphasis on those individual preferences that I think should be such a compelling reason to discard that hierarchical model. Because my preferences necessarily are not going to be taken into consideration by the federal government, because they have no way of knowing my preferences. A bottom-up polycentric model, it does. There is an opportunity for me to express that. I can express it through my governance token. I can express it through lots of different ways of belonging and engagement in these sorts of networks. So I actually think like a libertarian ought to reject this model on epistemological grounds alone. It's rooted in the 1950s, which we just know is a world that, one, we don't live in anymore, and two, just kind of wasn't too effective.
Yeah. I hope the libertarians listening take that to heart. Yeah, thanks so much for coming on. I highly encourage people to look into the progressive framework for Web3 that you lay out in your paper and give it a look, especially if you are, someone who wants to like move crypto away from kind of the mess that it is at the moment. There are some considerations to think about. If Quinn's paper is the progressive framework, then Balaji's is certainly a kind of right-wing libertarian one. And, in a world that covets decentralization, maybe it's time that we start thinking about different centers of thinking or logics to apply this technology in ways that, just would sound better than a network state at the moment, in my eyes. So thanks so much, Quinn. And thanks a lot, Kelsie, for co-hosting with me.
Grateful for the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you both.